Today I'm speaking with Dr. Justin Sledge. Dr. Sledge, welcome to the show.
Hey, thank you, Tim. Thank you so much for having me on.
I'm very excited about speaking with you. I've been looking forward to speaking with Dr. Sledge for a long time. And this is just, I love everybody that I talk to. I love the prep for it. I love the conversations. I love reflecting on what happened, but some of them just stand out a little bit more. And Dr. Sledge's work literally keeps me up at night. I wake up in the middle of the night and think I'm going to look at Dr. Sledge's stuff and see what I can find of insight. So I'm excited. I want to give a brief bio on that note, just so everyone knows just what we're talking about, because this is going to be some amazing stuff. Dr. Justin Sledge is a professor of religious studies and philosophy. He teaches at Wayne State University in Detroit. And I apologize, I'm looking down here, I'm just looking at some notes. He's a scholar of esoteric and magical traditions. He is the host of the Esoterica podcast and the husband of Rabbi Elena Alpert. Dr. Sledge's work on Esoterica explores the arcane side of history, philosophy, and religion. Dr. Sledge dives into ancient books such as the biblical Book of Daniel, the Book of Enoch, the Catastrophic War Scroll and the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Book of Jubilees, other mystery Gnostic literature, and the New Testament Book of Revelation. He also weaves in the mystical aspects of ancient Greek philosophy and magic through such philosophers and ancient cult leaders as Pythagoras and Parmenides, explaining how ancient philosophers incorporated both rationalism and naturalism as well as mysticism and esotericism. He dives into the histories behind religious communities in which mathematical, spiritual, and philosophical concepts of greater and greater complexity were revealed to the initiates. So he touches on that gnosis, he touches on harmonic totality, ritual laws regarding purity, monastics, talks about apocalyptic eschatological beliefs, cosmology and astrotheology, angelology, ecstatic visions. He brings in tremendous insights regarding other influences from far back, such as Mesopotamia and Egypt, all the way to first century Judaism, Christianity, and early church history. And just one more item here, he talks about a lot of different kind of books, which is, if you've never heard of this stuff, it's going to sound like, what is that? But I encourage you to watch his videos, and some of this will weave into this conversation. But obviously, he studies the Tanakh, the Old Testament, the Talmud, the Mishnah, Midrashim literature, the Dead Sea Scrolls, Nag Hammadi, as well as other Jewish rabbinic esoteric literature, such as the Merkabah literature, Hekhalot, Sefer Harazim, the Book of Secrets, and other Greco-Egyptian and Mesopotamian magic literature. That stuff, and this is my final part of the intro, the reason that stuff is so important to me is because one of the aspects when I got out of Christianity a year ago was that I became concerned about what was this thing called Christianity. If it wasn't what I thought it was, and I was aware it wasn't what I thought it was, what was it? And for those of you in the mythicist camp, you know that one of the biggest perspectives, biggest ideas out there is the possibility that through such books as the Book of Enoch, the Ascension of Isaiah, and other literature, we understand that it's possible that Jesus was in fact considered an archangel who was killed by the Archons up in space. And that, as much as that sounds weird to Christians who've never heard it, it's very possible. And so with that background, of course, someone like myself, needs to dive in and understand what does that mean? Is it possible? And there's a lot of stuff we're about to touch on that's going to have impacts on that study. So I'm excited. So again, Dr. Sledge, thank you so much for being able to speak today. I'm really looking forward to diving in.
Absolutely. It's wonderful. It's wonderful to be here. It's such an interesting topic. So I'm just really happy to be part of these conversations that are happening with so many people, so many brilliant people doing these really fascinating conversations about these topics that I think that unfortunately don't get enough air. So, but to be part of these conversations is just wonderful. So thank you for having me on and taking the time to chat with me.
Yeah, absolutely. And before we dive into some of the questions I had, could you tell us just a little bit more about your background, both in terms of your schooling and what you're doing now, what you're teaching, but also after that, could you talk about your religious background and where you are with theism and with God beliefs?
Sure. So my background is split between religious studies and philosophy. I have a PhD in philosophy, and I have an advanced degree from the University of Amsterdam, which is the only place in the world that basically gives an advanced degree in Western esotericism. So I studied in Amsterdam for several years and also have a PhD in philosophy. And so what I've turned my attention toward in the past several years is really thinking about the sort of philosophical background of a lot of these more esoteric ideas. So things like the history of magic or things like theurgy and these kinds of ideas. And so thinking about how philosophy intersects with a lot of these ideas, which doesn't get a lot of airtime, especially if you're major in philosophy or even do an advanced degree in philosophy. So that's basically sort of where I'm working at least intellectually. And then I have this my YouTube channel, Esoterica, where I'm really trying to get a lot of these more esoteric ideas out there, because I think people are interested in these topics. And the difficult thing, right, is to get access to some of this stuff is difficult. Many of these texts, for instance, are still in difficult to reach languages or really obscure books. And of course, the information on the internet about a lot of this material is really uneven. So you have some stuff that's really good and some stuff that's really bad. And so Esoterica is meant to get that material out there in a way that's balanced and scholarly, without me pushing an agenda. I'm not interested in trying to tell anyone what they should or shouldn't believe, or I'm like, look, this is the book, this is what it says, this is how we can put it in its historical context, or or ideas, magic, or whatever. And so trying to get that information out there in a reliable way so folks have access to it. So that's sort of a big project I'm working on now. I guess as for me and my background in terms of my religious beliefs, I am a Reconstructionist Jew. Reconstructionism was a denomination of Judaism that was founded in the early 20th century by Rabbi Mordecai Kaplan of blessed memory. And part of Reconstructionism is the idea that Judaism is always reinventing itself. It's a religious civilization that's constantly growing and changing through the ages. And part of what Reconstructionism is about is the idea that says, look, we have to take modernity seriously. And part of taking modernity seriously, this would be the Enlightenment and these kinds of ideas, is also just basically a rejection of supernaturalism. And so I would put myself in that camp. I don't believe in supernaturalistic things. So the God of the Hebrew Bible or this kinds of things, I don't think I'm not convinced that such an entity exists. Kind of nice if such an entity doesn't exist. I think that I could, and sometimes I tell people that I could really only be Jewish because I don't believe that entity exists. Because if that entity were real, it would be the kind of thing we would need to fight against at some level, not worship. It would be a cosmic bully of some kind. So yeah, I don't think that I would. And again, also I don't think a lot about considering myself an atheist, because I think that I'm more interested philosophically in what I do believe in as opposed to what I don't. Right. And so from a philosophical point of view, I'm more interested in hashing out, when we talk about God or when we talk about this entity, what are we talking about exactly? And so in that sense, do I find the arguments for the existence of the traditional arguments for the existence of a God compelling? Not really. I don't find them to be terribly convincing. But I could happily be wrong. There could be some deity out there. That's certainly possible. I don't have and I guess part of it's also just part of Judaism where this question of what we believe just isn't that big of a topic. Judaism is much more concerned with what you do and how you live your life and the daily rhythms of keeping the law. And so I would consider myself religious, but I wouldn't consider myself a person who spends a lot of time thinking about, God, although I do think a lot about theology.
Yeah. I don't want to get too far off track, but I do want to ask just if I kind of a question or two about what you just said. Do most Jews, this is obviously a generalization question, but do most Jews think much about like personal salvation and heaven and hell? Do most Jews expect to see their loved ones in an afterlife, or is that just such a broad spectrum that it'd be too hard to speak to quickly?
Yeah, it's a pretty broad spectrum. I think that, typically the answer is that Judaism has remained basically ambivalent about afterlife stuff. In fact, there are places in the Talmud where it says you shouldn't even speculate about that at all. Just don't even think about it at some level. I think that I think maybe in the very Orthodox world, they would think a lot more about afterlife. Yeah. But there's a range of opinions. Reincarnation, for instance, is a completely acceptable position in Orthodox Judaism. In Kabbalah, reincarnation is completely an acceptable belief. So there's a wide range of beliefs about this stuff. And typically Judaism has never really come down firmly on afterlife, on Messiah, on the nature of angels and demons. There's lots of speculation, but you're never going to get a doctrinal position in a significant way. And the joke, right, is that we go ask a rabbi what happens to me when I die, and the rabbi's going to tell you, I don't know, I'm not dead yet. So you just don't get these sort of really hardcore positions about that kind of stuff. But yeah, there are definitely Jews out there that very much believe in Messiah, very much believe in afterlife, very much believe in Gehenna, the place of torment. And there are lots of other Jews that say, no, that's not a thing.
Yeah, it's a fascinating topic. It's not one for us to dive too deep into today, but I'd love to dive into that more myself and ask you some questions about it on a future one, because it's fascinating, because I don't think most Christians understand where most Jews are coming from. I certainly did not know that, and just how I didn't realize how many Jews were also very much more focused on, like you said, the living a life of kindness, changing the world for good. I've been exposed a little bit about that with recent studies with Chabad Lubavitch, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. But just learning how some factions of Judaism focus and make sure that they instill in their children the way to live. But I think a lot of Christians just assume pretty much that all Jews, unless they're truly atheistic, but most Jews, I should say, are probably believing the Old Testament literally and waiting for a Messiah who is not Jesus. And that's pretty much like the bulk of what most Christians think of as a Jewish perspective. So it's interesting hearing more about that. Do you personally have any sense of a Messiah coming, or is that part of the supernaturalism that you've rejected?
Yeah, I think that would be part of the supernaturalism side of things, where I think the concept of Messiah is a really important concept. The idea that that the world is fundamentally broken and is in need of repair. But I think that the way that Reconstructionism, for instance, thinks about Messiah is that no one's coming to save us. We have to take that responsibility onto ourselves. And the idea of tikkun olam, this idea of repairing the world, is a very core conception in Reconstructionism, the idea that we have to be the Messiah. There's no Messiah coming. And if the world's going to get fixed, it's going to be human beings, common everyday human beings, that are going to have to do that work. So yeah, a big part of my life and my partner's life is, she's the executive director and founder of Detroit Jews for Justice, a social justice organization that works really hard. She works really hard to try to make the world a better place for everybody. So I think the messianic ideas, if we're going to live in a messianic world, it's because we built it, not because someone's come along and done the work for us.
Yeah. Just a final question on this before we dive in to the other topics. Do you find that more Orthodox Jews really fight against the more liberal, non-supernatural Judaistic perspectives? Are they just like very, very upset about it and trying to push back a lot?
Oh, sure. I mean, they're definitely, you go to the really Haredi world, the world of the ultra-Orthodox world, sometimes they're referred to as. The Haredi just means the ones that tremble. So these are the guys that you often see with the payas, the curls, and the black hats and things like that. And I think that they would gladly say that we're not even Jews. They would say that we're apostates and that we're the reason why the Messiah hasn't come. I mean, that we're sinful and things like this. I mean, again, even in the aftermath of the Holocaust, you have some of these really, really Orthodox folks are saying the reason why Hitler was able to do what he did was because of liberal Jews, that God was punishing Jews for not being observant. And you get this really extreme kind of theology that operates in those circles. And it's not a theology I subscribe to, but we don't have the luxury of saying, well, they're not really Jewish. They are. And then their theology is, that theology goes back centuries. That's the Crusaders during the violence there. People thought the same thing, and even back as far as the Hebrew Bible, where the idea that God is punishing the Israelites for not being pious. That kind of Deuteronomistic theology goes back thousands of years, and so it's still alive and well, and in very Orthodox circles.
That's incredible. I don't think I've really processed that part of it yet. How big of a deal that is. Just to wrap that discussion up, that is a guilt trip beyond guilt trips. Wow, yeah. That's about the biggest guilt trip I think I've ever heard of. Going into your topics, first question I should ask you, just for those who haven't heard the word esoteric or esotericism, could you just quickly define that and what that's all about?
Sure. So typically religions are going to have, scholars of religion typically think that most religions have both an exoteric and an esoteric side. The exoteric side is going to be the public face of the religion. So this would be the kinds of things like baptism in Christianity, right? This will be the public side of Christianity. Well, most religions also have an esoteric side. That is a side of their religious beliefs or their spirituality that is not so public, right?
Hmm.
And that more hidden dimension is typically what is covered by the term esotericism. So this would be someone like the mystics, right? So we have someone like Meister Eckhart, pretty famous Catholic, who in his day-to-day life was, I'm sure, just a regular old, exoteric Christian. He did the kinds of things that one would do if one were a good Catholic. But inside, right, when he was actually writing his own private thoughts, he had very, very interesting mystical theological beliefs. And those more mystical beliefs we would house typically on the more esoteric side of things. For instance, the Catholic Church today has many exoteric beliefs that are pretty common. Exorcism, for instance, is still practiced widely. In fact, there are more exorcists now in 2020 than there probably were 50 years ago. Exorcism is making a huge comeback in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. I guess the demons are out for whatever reason. So typically we think of something like exorcism as being more esoteric side of Christianity, for instance. So it's just the hidden dimension of religiosity. So this would be things like magic, things like alchemy, astrology to some degree, things like spirit possession, and these sorts of topics, occult philosophy, the occult in general, which again, Christian people often forget that, there's been Christian occultism for a very long time. And while many Christians find that to be religiously inappropriate or forbidden, perhaps, things being forbidden don't really stop people from doing them.
Right. Would you lump the mystery cults, so like the Greco-Roman mystery cults, into that category?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, because the mystery cults, right, were explicitly about not revealing what went on in them. Yeah. And so the word, again, the word mystery, right, means to be silent, right? The word means to conceal or to be quiet, to close the mouth. And so if we think about the cult of something like Eleusis, the Eleusinian mysteries, you were sworn to secrecy, and we have cases in history where people revealed some of what they experienced, and it was really, really taboo. Alcibiades being the most famous example of someone in history, the Greek general famously let slip some of what went on in the Eleusinian mysteries, and it was not okay. So yeah, those are explicitly concealed aspects of what would otherwise be public Greek religious life, sacrifices and things like that.
It's interesting that you see that woven into the New Testament a little bit, where, for example, Jesus talks parables to the crowds, and the disciples say, "Why are you doing this in parables?" And he says, "Well, to the hoi polloi, it's the parables, but to you, the initiates, the inside group, I'm going to reveal the mysteries." And Paul brings that into the things that were hidden from the foundation of the world, but now I'm going to bring these mysteries out to everybody. A little bit less mysterious in that sense, where he's proclaiming the mysteries, but still that's the concept and background.
No, for sure. I mean, you have this in Mark. That's sort of the hidden. The Gospel of Mark is very much interested in the sort of hidden aspect of Jesus's messianic claims. So yeah, that's definitely the case that it seems like early Christianity, the Jesus movement, which I'd prefer to call it the Jesus movement at that point, that there certainly was some aspect of there being an inner outer aspect of that, and you see this in lots of Jewish teachings at that time.
Yeah, it's a lot of the people that are studying this and have really put lots of time into it. There's a clarification more and more of the Jesus movement was not copying mystery cults. It was a mystery cult. And it's been really interesting to see it that way and to realize, yeah, that's exactly what they're doing. They're syncretizing some of the aspects that other people are doing, but it's certainly a Jewish version of a mystery cult. And it's helpful once you realize that's what's happening to put. It helps you interpret what you're seeing in the scripture and in the history. So in that note, could you help us? This is the first main question I had for you. Could you put Jesus in a first century BCE to first century CE Jewish perspective, what were the Jews? I mean, I know a little bit. I know they were certainly apocalyptic. I know they were certainly over Hellenized. I know they were certainly frustrated with the whole 70 AD thing with their temple being destroyed. But could you put some more meat on that, structure? What was a Jew, and what did Jesus mean to a Jew in the first century, before and after supposedly Christ came? What was that? What did that world look like for a Jew?
Yeah, and it's a complicated world. I mean, you have lots of different Judaisms, right? So one thing that's important to notice, right? Sometimes people talk about Christianity emerging out of Judaism. I think that's a mistaken way of thinking about it. I think that rabbinical Judaism and Christianity both emerge out of a kind of matrix of Judaisms, some of which some Judaisms went extinct, and the rabbinical version did not. Christianity certainly didn't either. I think that you're talking about a world of lots of different competing Judaisms. You have the temple cult that is operating there, which is very cozy with the Roman Empire. You have this apocalyptic strain of Judaism that is certainly waiting impatiently for some kind of unveiling that is going to happen. And I think typically they thought about that in political terms. That is to say, they thought that God was going to intervene directly into the world and basically fix the world in some kind of dramatic, perhaps catastrophic way. The folks that are living out at Qumran, the Essenes, seem to have believed something like that, and very likely got them killed, actually. That is to say that they really believed that the war with the Romans was this moment. And if we're to trust Josephus, they went out to fight and they died. They all got slaughtered. And that's why their scrolls sat in those caves for 2,000 years.
And you think that it's possible they were fighting, thinking as they did this fight that the Messiah would come and help them win?
Oh, yeah. I think that if you read the War Scroll, right, which is basically sort of their vision of what's going to go down, they thought that things were going to go very, very badly for quite a while. And then at the very end of the very last desperate moment, God would intervene directly into the situation and destroy the Kittim, their code word for the Romans. And again, if we're to trust Josephus, we know they had a strategos, a general. If Josephus is right, again, Josephus is always taking with a grain of salt sometimes. Josephus is mostly interested in making sure that you really like Josephus. But if we're to trust him, and I think we could, they were basically slaughtered. I think that they fought to the last man and waiting for God to show up, and didn't. I think when your strategy is God will help us at the very last moment, you should probably stay home. I don't think that's a great balance. I don't think any Marines or anything are going to hold up to that strategy.
Quick side question: are you familiar with Christian apocalypticism in terms of like just the people that have, we call them date setters? Have you heard some of that? There was a guy I listened to as a kid. Our station is called Family Radio. It's out in California. It's otherwise a pretty good Christian. If you're a Christian, it's a pretty good Christian organization. Very conservative. Just reads a lot of scripture, lots of good Bible stories and songs. But the man, several men founded it, but a lot of them I think died off. So the man that was kind of left in charge was a little bit more of off, so to speak, to use a gentler term. He's a little bit off, and he was into numerology exponentially. He just loved numerology. And I think 2, maybe even 3 times he set dates. But the last time he said, look, I have fixed everything. This is it. I'm sure this is it. Jesus is coming back. And people literally were selling their homes and everything and just driving around with these huge signs on their RVs saying Jesus is coming back on such and such a date. And it was pretty sad to see. It was
and this is a thing that and this is Isaac Newton did the same thing. We have Isaac Newton's calculation for the end of the world. I think it's a couple hundred years out from now. I mean, I think even in the New Testament, right, you have Paul telling people, "Hey, quit looking at the sky, waiting for Jesus to return." It's I think one of my favorite comments was in the year 1000 in Spain. A Muslim commentator was noticing, that it was turning to the year 1000, and it said the Christians threw a grand party for Jesus, and unfortunately he never showed up. So this is a thing. In fact, in the Talmud, there's a great line that says, "Cursed be the calculators." And there's even an idea in Judaism that for every time someone attempts to calculate when the Messiah will come, God pushes the date back that much time. So if you calculate the Messiah will come in 300 years, God's like, all right, well, the Messiah is going to come here, and now we're going to push the date back to punish you. So the idea is that calculating itself is considered to be even trying to calculate when the Messiah will come in Judaism is frowned upon and even punished at some level.
Yeah.
But yeah, this idea.
Good.
But yeah, I mean, to go back to the original question, and also again, Judaism, the Jews at this time are spread all over the Roman world. We're talking about their Jewish populations in southern France. There's a huge population in Rome. Alexandria at that time probably had a larger Jewish population in that city, in that region, than the entire population of Judea. So there are
Was that because of the library mostly, or for other reasons?
I think there's other reasons. I think that there had been a continuous Jewish presence in Egypt. We have Jewish documents, I think dating back to the 7th century from the Elephantine Islands, to the 7th century BCE. So there's been a continuous Jewish presence all the way back to at least the Persian period in Egypt. And in fact, the largest population of Jews in the world, I think in the 19th century, in many ways, was still Egypt. Egypt had a massive Jewish population. And so Alexandrian Judaism, people forget there was a temple functioning in Alexandria. There was another completely different temple that had animal sacrifices and that was whatever they were doing there, which we don't know much about. There were hundreds of thousands of Jewish people living in Alexandria, and Onias III had founded a temple there, and we know it was functioning. So,
is that the Elephantine?
So that was another temple. Yeah, that was another temple that we know of that was also functioning, although hundreds of years earlier. The Elephantine Island temple, we know about it because it was in a riot with the local indigenous Egyptians that it got torn down or destroyed. And they wrote a letter to Jerusalem being like, hey, can we rebuild it? And they said, yeah, but you can sacrifice things, but you can't sacrifice animals anymore there. So you can keep sacrificing grain and incense and maybe wine or something, but you can't do any more animal sacrifices, which meant that they were. So even, again, the vision we have of Judaism as sort of all the Jews are living in Palestine in the 1st century, that's just not the case. So I think that someone like Philo of Alexandria would have looked at what was going on in Judea with a bit of embarrassment. Like, these crazy people over there, religious zealots, he bragged about the fact that he didn't know Hebrew. He was like, no, I'm a cosmopolitan, Greek, Hellenized, he was one of the richest guys in Alexandria. And he was very proud of the fact that he donated a bunch of gold to the construction of the temple and stuff. So he did his duty, but he wasn't, making a big deal about it. But I think that there was certainly a messianic expectation, and we know that because there were lots of messiahs that were around. Josephus lets us know of several different ones that lived. And we also know there were lots of these miracle-working type people, especially in the Galilee. The Galilee, weirdly enough, seemed to have produced several of these people, Jesus being one. We can talk about some of these other guys, Hanina ben Dosa and Choni the Circle Maker, which are these miracle-working Galileans that had the Galilee kind of had a reputation for producing these people.
Were some of them more violent, or were they all just like preachers? Yeah,
so Choni definitely got involved in politics, and it got him killed. So he was involved in the sort of political world of the 1st century BCE. And then the other messianic characters that we know of from that time period certainly were involved directly in attempting to fight with either Herod or with the Romans. And so there's no doubt that Messiah at that time was understood as someone who basically was going to engage in a fight with the Romans and throw them out with God's help. And I think you see this, Jesus being executed, I think, for treason, basically. And again, the scene with the Gerasene demoniac, right, where this guy is possessed by a legion. I think that we now don't hear the fact it's like being possessed by a battalion. We don't hear the idea of a person being possessed by a Roman military contingent. It's really difficult to not hear a political commentary in which Jesus pulls that legion out, throws into a bunch of pigs, and they run off a cliff into a bunch of water and die. It's pretty clear the writer of that text there, I think in Matthew, that writer is imagining Jesus casting the Romans out into the Mediterranean. Because
I've never heard that before, but that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, I think from a Jewish perspective, right? He takes basically a military contingent, a legion, right? The basic unit of the Roman army, and he throws them into unclean animals. And again, he's in the Transjordan. There's no big water sources in the Transjordan. So even the geography doesn't make any sense. The pigs run off a cliff into a bunch of water and die. Well, what cliff what body of water are they falling into?
Yeah.
Well, I think it's the Mediterranean. So I think that that there are certainly political overtones to that. Jesus is going to exorcise Palestine, basically, is what's going to happen. And I
It's
think
like a messianic threat.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that you see this with Theudas, right? Theudas is another messianic character that Josephus mentions, who was also a rebel, who was executed by the Romans. And of course, Shimon bar Kokhba, who's going to emerge about a century after the execution of Jesus, who was very popular among the rabbis and very successful. I mean, successful enough to mint coins. So his administration, as much as it was one, had infrastructure of some kind.
Yeah. Can I ask you a quick side question about that?
Sure.
There's a show on Netflix that I'm watching. It's called Unorthodox. Are you familiar with it?
Mm-hmm.
If I'm saying the name correctly, and it's about a girl that was married to a very Orthodox Jewish guy, and she was very unhappy and about her exit, and people sitting on the edge of their seats to see what happens if they can make it work or if she stays escaping, so to speak. But in that they have this idea of there's like the general group, the community, the rabbis that are very religious, they're very upright, they, do the right thing, but they've kind of got this one guy that's like a hitman. He's like, look, we're gonna have one guy that's he's like, we kind of prefer he not be here, but the fact that he is here, but he's kind of a rough guy, let's use him to get some of our rough work done.
Right.
And is that kind of it seems like that's like, I'm sure that the Jews would prefer peace. Obviously, Judaism wants world peace. That's pretty clear. But at the same point, they also want to do it, the biblical way. Were they do you think they were kind of like, well, we don't really want a war, but if we've got some of these guys that are willing to get the swords out and start fighting, let's use it. Kind of like, even like God in the Old Testament used the Jewish, Joshua to go in and slaughter people. It's like, were they truly violent and wanting violence, or were they like, we'd rather study our Torah and our books, but please do fight so that we can get back to Judaism? Like, how do you think it worked?
I think that they were both. I think that there was certainly a violent fact. I mean, again, if you look at the Jewish war, right, there was certainly a violent faction that was very interested in directly fighting both Hellenized Jews and the Romans, the Sicarii and these sort of the Zealots and things like this. And you can see this in the Talmud with the discussions around Bar Kokhba, for instance. One of the most famous rabbis of that time period, Rabbi Akiva, was very pro Bar Kokhba. He thought that he was the Messiah. He was really convinced of this. And the other rabbis mocked Akiva and said, "Look, grass will grow in your cheeks, and the Son of Man will not have come. So you'll be dead in the ground." And sadly, Akiva did not have the luxury of being buried. He was tortured and burned alive by the Romans. And so grass did not grow in his cheeks, unfortunately. But the idea, there was many Romans. Yochanan, there's a famous story of Yochanan ben Zakkai, who was basically snuck out of Jerusalem during the war. And so you definitely had a war faction that was all about the war, and you had another faction that said, this is a crazy idea. You're not going to be able to beat the Romans. Like, we don't need to be doing this. And so that the non-war party, had nothing positive to say about it. So much so that Hanukkah, the festival of Hanukkah, the reason why in Judaism there's so much attention paid to the miracle of the rededication of Hanukkah, and part of the reason why the Book of Maccabees just isn't preserved by Jews, is because the rabbis were basically so exhausted with war that books like the Maccabees, the rabbis just had no interest in preserving it. And so many Jews have never read the Book of Maccabees. They've never studied the actual war itself, but they all know the story about the miraculous rededication of the temple. The Romans are like, we like the miracle, and we don't like the fighting. And so, there was a war party, there was an anti-war party, and I think, like many people, same with the American Revolution, we like to forget that when the revolution broke, it was a third, a third, a third. A third were enthusiastically pro-revolution, a third were neutral, and a third were anti. It wasn't like everyone was John Adams gung-ho for fighting the British Empire because they realized that was a bad idea. And I think that probably was true during Jews at this time too, that you have lots of Jews who are like, and again, you run the gamut. You have folks like the so-called Sadducees who are very cozy with the Roman administration, and they don't want a fight with the Romans. They in fact, they see their livelihood tied up with the Roman regime. And then of course you have people that would have been, I think, much more politically hostile to the Romans, people like Bar Kokhba, Jesus perhaps, that were certainly willing to engage in spiritual apocalyptic combat or just straight military fighting. And again, so yeah, with someone like Bar Kokhba, and the Zealots, right? I mean, Zealots, people forget that that whole Masada business, that was 3 years after the temple was destroyed. They held out there for 3 years, right? Until the Romans eventually got around to doing the dirty work of destroying that fortified position. So these were hardcore, dead enders of a certain kind, who really were willing to engage in violence to the very, very end.
Could I ask, going back a little bit, the Greek influence? I've seen, you've touched a lot about on your videos with Parmenides and Pythagoras, but you have, as you said, Jews in Alexandria, and so even though they weren't there per se for the library exclusively, they were had a lot of other religions, other ideas available to them, both because it's just a cosmopolitan area and because of the library. You certainly just have overall, even in the direct right there all over the Levant, you've got the Hellenistic influence, and you've got obviously the mystery cults, and you've got even temples to some of these gods and demigods right there in Israel. I would imagine there was a huge portion of Judaism that wanted to just get rid of it all and say, get all this pagan stuff out of here. But at the same time, it seems like there's a lot of syncretism going on, a lot of people working together, and it seems like there's a sense of willingness to say, let's incorporate this, almost like a parallel to how there were some Egyptian gods, and when the Greek influence kind of came along, they kind of made a parallel and said, that Egyptian god, this guy has a different name, but it's the same god. And it's almost like some of that syncretism they were willing to work with it. And I'm just curious, between things like Pythagoras and certainly the gematria, the whole cosmology, the issue, we're going to get into that in a second, but the whole levels of heaven, the logos, how much did Jews weave in the Greek worldview into directly into their theology?
Sure. There's a wide range, right? So Philo, someone like Philo of Alexandria, is he's basically attempting to synthesize Judaism and Greek philosophy, and does a really incredible job. In fact, in many ways, the very concept of the logos that is basically the theology, the logos theology, that obviously underwrites a great deal of Trinitarian economics. That stuff's being imported, not exactly wholesale from Philo, but really, really closely. They're really importing a lot of ideas from Philo. Of course, Philo is not preserved by Jewish scholars, right? So rabbis didn't read Philo. There's basically no evidence of an impact he had on the development, for instance, of the Talmud at all. So I think that many of the rabbis in Palestine would have looked at Philo and thought he was a Hellenizing apostate of some kind, and I'm pretty sure he'd have looked at them and thought of them as religious bumpkins who are backwards, and something like that. I think he would have had a very low opinion of them as well. But yeah, we're looking at a very syncretistic world. We can see that in lots of ways. I think one of the more interesting ways is actually from what little we know about what the temple looked like. There's actually heavy Greek influence on artistic side in the actual Jerusalem temple. There seems to be, some of the fire pans and stuff that we think that were recovered from the Cave of Letters. Some of those have Greek imagery on them, and we were told by Josephus and other people there was Greek imagery actually inside of the temple. One of the really early synagogues that survived at Sepphoris. One of the things that's really famous about that synagogue is that the floor of the synagogue is a massive mosaic of the Hellenistic astrological wheel.
Like the Zodiac?
Yeah, the Zodiac. Yeah, it's the Zodiac. And this is an idea that is not, astrology is not native to Israelite theology, although there's interesting debates about it. Some Jews are very for it, and some Jews are very against it. But clearly, whoever designed that synagogue, which again is the core aspect of rabbinical life, the thing that they thought to decorate it with was basically a Hellenistic theory of the universe at some level. So, and again, that's in a synagogue. That's not some aberrant magic building or whatever. I guess as much as synagogues aren't, not magical themselves in some ways, but that's part and parcel of that world. And also we can see this in the magic that was being practiced in what's recovered from ancient Alexandria or ancient Egypt. We have a huge amount of magical documents that have been preserved from the late classical period, basically. And we can see that many of those documents are enormously syncretistic, which again is not surprising. I mean, I think that you could. I'm pretty sure out there to this day, right? There are. I imagine there are Southern Baptists who do yoga classes,
Right.
and from a religious studies perspective, we would say, look, this is an example of interesting syncretism where a person is incorporating Hindu ideas and Hindu practices into their thing, and they wouldn't see themselves as being, I guess, syncretistic.
Right.
But this just still goes on in a pretty big way. You know, you think about voodoo and things like this in the American South. But at any rate, yeah, I think that they were in a wide range. I think one of my there's an interesting section in the Talmud where the most famous heretic in Jewish lore, who actually isn't Jesus. Jesus is basically very rarely mentioned in the Talmud at all. But the big heretic is a guy named Elisha ben Abuya. He's in fact so reviled that the Talmud just refers to him as Acher, the other one. They don't even name him sometimes because of his heresy. Exactly what his heresy is actually unclear. But the famous thing, right, is that he would, when he would stand up, Greek books would fall out of his clothes. He'd been hiding them, and he would hiding these Greek books. And when he would stand up, they'd fall out of his garments. And so they were like, and there's a section that says, cursed be the father that teaches his son Greek ideas. And so in the Jewish world, there's a huge range. I mean, you have someone like Philo, who's enthusiastically a Hellenizer, and then you have who really enthusiastically adopting all kinds of ideas. You can see in a synagogue, right? We have the Zodiac business. And then, of course, we have more hardcore Jewish partisans, you might call them, who are actively anti-Greek, right, and really dislike Greek culture, Greek science. There's debate about whether or not Greek science should be learned at all by Jews, and some rabbis are more willing to engage in it, and some are definitely very, very hostile.
Yeah. When you look at the parallels to mystery cults, and it's seeing this from the perspective that the Jesus movement was originally a Jewish Jesus movement, the Gentiles did get brought into it, obviously, but you're looking at things where there's so many parallels to Greek mystery cults, such as the idea of this revelatory initiation into it. You have the fictive kinship where you become a brother and sister of each other, and even of your chosen deity or demigod. You have the baptismal initiation where you do the bread and the beer, or the bread and the wine, and you become part of the family. You certainly have the baptism. I'm sure that was been going on for a lot longer than Christianity, but all these things that were already part of things like the Dionysius, I believe it is the mystery cult for Dionysius. From what I understand, a lot of it was parallel to Mithraism as well. And if this was not obviously a Gentile, cult, so to speak, at the beginning, if it was a Jewish sect doing this, it seems like they really would have. It's almost like they took some of these ideas and just said, let's Judaize it. Like let's take what we know about this mystery cult, and that's the Dionysius with his wine, and Mithraism with their secrets, and let's merge it together, and then let's bring the one critical aspect of Judaism into it: blood sacrifice atonement. Make that central, and once we do, we've got our own acceptable mystery cult. And I guess my question is that the way that it possibly evolved? And then a kind of a corollary question is, with the whole destruction of the temple in 70 AD, was this possibly part of a Jewish response to say, look, we have to have blood sacrifice. We've been doing this forever. We have to have it. If we now cannot have it, we need an explanation to say, all right, what is God up to? And were they saying, all right, God did do the blood sacrifice, but he just did it once and for all through Jesus, the final perfect spotless lamb?
Yeah, so there's a lot of complex questions there.
Sorry to throw them all at you at once.
Yeah, no, that's fine. It's fine. Let me try to tease them apart a little bit. So I guess the question for me would be, when exactly are we talking about in the development of the Jesus movement? And clearly there are clear parallels in early Christian ideas, for instance, with Mithraism. As much as we know about Mithraism, the Mithraic cult has managed to keep their secrets very well, but certainly Mithraeums in early churches look pretty similar. So in the early days of the Jesus movement, right, this would be the period, I would think, prior to the destruction of the temple. I think, right, that most of the early Jesus followers, almost all of them were probably located in Jerusalem, were basically functioning as Jews. I think they would have been basically unrecognizably different from in their day-to-day practice. In fact, in the Book of Acts, we still have them going to the temple. They're still basically operating as religious Jews. And I think also religious Judaism had a wide range of practices at this time. And so there wasn't even a unified idea about exactly how one did Judaism. That's a much later idea. I mean, the Essenes, for instance, even used a completely different calendar. They used a solar calendar. They weren't even observing Jewish holidays on the same days that the folks in Jerusalem were celebrating them. And it doesn't seem like they had anything to do with the temple at all.
Because they used a lunar calendar?
Well, no, they used a solar one. They used, it appears that the Essene folks were using a solar calendar that...
But I mean, the other Jews were lunar?
Yeah, a lunar solar, a lunisolar calendar. That is to say that the typical calendar that was being used at that time was a lunar calendar that had a solar correction. Over the course of 36 months, you had a leap month into the calendar that prevents the holidays from drifting through the seasons, right? Because otherwise you would have a harvest festival in the middle of, January sometime, or what we now call January. The folks out at the Essenes did not do that. They had a totally different calendar. And also the rabbis, the Pharisees, they were also increasingly distancing themselves from the theory of the kind of theology that made the temple so central. When the temple was destroyed, they basically had a kind of Judaism ready-made, so they could transfer a lot of the ideas of the temple and the temple symbolism to the home. And so there's a long-standing idea in Judaism going back to the days of the Mishnah and the Talmud that says that the dinner table is now the temple. That the hand washing and all the things that you do as part of Jewish rituals have actually get transferred from the temple into the home. And the Pharisees were already practicing a version like that. So when the temple was destroyed, they were like, well, we already have a functioning version of Judaism that really doesn't even need the temple anymore. So the first thing is I will say that I think that the early Jesus movement was basically just Judaism, just a idiosyncratic version of Judaism. Now, I think as that Jesus movement becomes exported into the Mediterranean basin, the Eastern Mediterranean world, I think that it's there that we begin to see, one, the drift away, that Judaism and Christianity are going their separate ways. And I think that as they begin to go their separate ways, Christianity begins to look a lot more like the religiosity of the Eastern Mediterranean. And so it begins to look a lot more like things like mystery cults or things like the sort of religiosity of that world. But you look at the things like baptism, you look at things like the bread and the bread and the wine, those are just natively Jewish things, right? Mikveh, the idea of ritual immersion was it still is in the Orthodox world a weekly practice for many Jews. Ritual immersion was a very common practice. Like I said, it still is. I go to the mikveh, still a thing that people do. And of course, bread and wine, that's just every week in a Jewish home, right? Shabbat is going to be bread and wine. It's the two main blessings you're going to make. So it's unsurprising those have become core components in Christianity because they're just core components of practical Jewish life. I think what's interesting about the question of blood atonement when it comes to the question of Jesus is that one of the things that I find interesting in the New Testament when I read it is that it's not clear exactly, with the execution of Jesus and his subsequent resurrection, the early Christians aren't quite sure what he means. The very concept of what has happened isn't clear. And so what's interesting, I think, is that there are competing theories about what exactly Jesus has done, what exactly has he accomplished. And the blood atonement theory is certainly the one that won. That's the one that you see spelled out in Hebrews, and it certainly seems to be the one that Paul liked. But it wasn't the first one. I think this ransom theory, the ransom theory of atonement, with the idea that, and you see this in the early apostolic fathers as well, this ransom theory is still around, where basically that you have all these, I'm sure you've heard this theory, right? We have all the folks trapped in hell,
Yeah.
and basically Jesus is sent sort of like a Rambo into hell, and he's a trick, right? He's ransomed all these people out, but the devil doesn't realize that it's a trick, and then Jesus actually gets out too. So it's like this kind of Rambo version of Christianity. And the ransom theory just didn't take for whatever reason. It was not or it was incorporated into the blood atonement theory.
Right.
So I think that what's interesting to me about it is that basically you have early Christianity kind of, what's the right word, building the ship at sea. Their leader has been executed and allegedly resurrected, and they have to be like, okay, what does that mean? What does it mean for him to be the Messiah who's died and ascended? And so they have to sort of develop the theology as it develop the theology as it goes. And you can see these theological debates early on, very early in the New Testament, and obviously you can see them developing through the rise of the proto-orthodoxy, where it's not even clear exactly how Jesus and the Father and the Holy Spirit relate to one another, and the whole icky business of Arianism and Trinitarian economics. So even by the 4th century, they're still not exactly sure how all this is supposed to work. And so, so again, the blood atonement stuff, I think even by the period of the rabbis, they're not that interested in this theory anymore either. Of course, they know about the rituals, but they don't. I think that by the destruction of the temple, I can easily imagine there were lots of rabbis thinking to themselves, "I'm glad that's over." Like, I know we're supposed to be sad about it, but kind of glad that part of it's over.
Yeah.
And again, you see how quickly they adapt. I mean, Judaism. I won't say it. I don't say it doesn't skip a beat, but Judaism keeps on keeping on. It's not like it was, So I think that has to do with the theological innovations going on among the folks that we know as the Pharisees or the rabbis.
It's always been like a ongoing joke that Christians have of so many conservative Christians are against the concept of evolution, regarding how we all, the planet, how evolution occurred with, the start of life and so forth, all the way up to us. And it's funny, they're so against evolution, but yet when you look at the histories that what we're talking about, it evolved all over the place. Like, it's one of the craziest examples of evolution. It's obviously not physical life evolution, but the evolution of the story and of the structure and of the institutionalizing of this religion. It's got so many levels of evolution to it. It's amazing. Could I ask on that? I'm sorry, go ahead.
Sure, and this is also true of Judaism.
Yeah.
I think if you go listen to, I'm pretty sure if you go into certain neighborhoods in New York, there'll be Jews that will gladly tell you that Moses wore a black hat and spoke Yiddish. And the idea that they're practicing Judaism the same way it was practiced 2,000 years ago, I mean, it's simply not true. Right. Judaism is an evolving religious civilization, and it's changing. It's constantly changing. It's been changing, since the days of Israelite religion, where who knows exactly how all that worked.
Yeah.
People often will say things like, well, Judaism has been practiced for 3,000 years. I'm like, I think whatever they were doing 3,000 years ago at Tel Dan or whatever David was doing in the temple, or or not the temple, whatever Solomon was doing in that temple, it's nothing like Judaism now. It's unrecognizable in many ways.
Yeah. Could I throw in a couple quick questions? I didn't prompt you for these before, but I just want to see, we can pass them real quick if it's nothing you're familiar with. But do you have any sense of whether or not the Romans had anything to do with origins of Christianity? In other words, you've got this some Jews that were more willing to be peaceful and passive, other Jews that would have said, you guys are traitors and, fight for our temple, fight for our country. And, the zealots, people that wanted to take up the sword. And there are obviously all these wars. People are tired of the bloodshed, but also the Romans are tired of the bloodshed. They're tired of all this fighting that they can't keep Israel peaceful. Yeah. And some people have brought up the suggestion that there's some evidence, and I honestly admit my, ability to speak to this, to defend it. But there's some evidence that the Romans may have been directly involved, partially through people like Josephus, but through other means as well, to begin to slowly try to influence Judaism toward this, to say, look, you don't need to fight for your temple to be restored. You don't need to fight that your temple's gone. your religion has been fulfilled in this character Jesus. Therefore, stop fighting. And thus you get passages like in Paul, submit to the authorities. They're there from God, and other places. And it's, Jesus even saying, render to Caesar what is Caesar's and to God what is God's. And people are questioning whether or not the Romans may have actually overseen any of this. Have you ever dove into that topic? And do you feel like, even if it's the first you're hearing of it, do you feel like there's any possibility that's part of the story?
I mean, it would be weird, especially considering the Romans' attitude toward Christianity early on. The Romans have a somewhat dismissive attitude of Judaism in general. They think of it as a weird kind of superstition, to use their word.
Yeah.
And they certainly think of Christianity as a very weird, it's new, right? That's the thing the Romans don't like about Christianity, is that it's new. Like, they don't consider new and religion in the Roman mind doesn't make any sense. And so it would be weird if the Romans were trying to influence Judaism through Christianity, because one, the Romans' attitude toward Christianity and Judaism was just so basically negative, especially toward Christianity. And two, I think that it didn't work, right? Like, Jews did not convert in mass to Christianity. Christianity was primarily successful not among Jews. It was primarily successful, at least early on, in places like Egypt and in places like Anatolia, sort of the Eastern Mediterranean basin. It did not take hold in Judea, in sort of the Galilee and stuff. You just don't see a lot of evidence of Jews converting in mass to this religion. And I think that's part of the reason why Paul shifts gears. It's just like, because I think a lot of the ideas are just incomprehensible to most Jews. I think they just weren't, and that's often the thing that I think many modern Christians don't really realize when the Jewish mind, the Jewish attitude toward things like Messiah is so unlike the way that they're conceived in Christianity, that often Christians will pitch Christianity to Judaism to Jews, and Jews are like, I have no idea what you're talking about. Right. You're using all the same words, and they don't mean anything like the same thing. So I think it would be weird, right, for those two reasons, that the Romans had, basically a negative opinion of Christianity for quite some time. And two, right, that if it were meant to pacify the Jews, it certainly didn't work. There were lots of, the Jews rebelled again in 132 during the Bar Kokhba rebellion, and there were Jewish rebellions all the way into the 3rd and 4th centuries. There was a massive rebellion at the Nile Crete. A Jewish rebellion continued well after the period of Christianity. So if it were meant to pacify the Jews, it certainly didn't work. I think it backfired.
And since they were polytheistic, they really saw monotheism of any kind as equivalent to atheism, right?
It's weird. I think that they just saw monotheism as just a bizarre idea of like that. Why would you? I think the Romans thought of the idea of a single invisible God worshipable only in one temple is just a strange belief. In fact, they use the word superstition. That's the word that they typically use. Yeah. But the Romans have this weird attitude toward Judaism. They're like, look, it's a weird superstition, but it's old, so it must be something. Okay. Right? And it's the antiquity of it that really makes the Romans respect it. And again, you have to understand, I think, that there were many Jews who were very comfortable with Roman power. If you look at the temple was actually built with a huge Roman garrison attached to it. If you actually look at a model of the temple, a big part of it is just a Roman garrison. And the Roman soldiers would have marched around the periphery of it as part of both protecting the temple and also protecting their interests there. So there was a whole class of Jews who were very interested in being cozy to the Romans. Yeah. And there were rabbis who were also cozy with the Romans. They were like, look, the Romans are, there's a saying in Mishnah that if it weren't for government, people would eat each other. And they're probably remembering some of these terrible times where they're during the rebellions. And of course, you have the exact opposite position too. And I think Jesus is just a very complicated character. We have these sort of peacenik versions of the things he says. But then you have these other weird things where, Jesus says things like, if you have only one sword, sell your cloak and buy another one. And you're like, what's that all about? Like, what's going on with these things? And I think that, at least so far as things like the principle of embarrassment is a pretty good way of analyzing texts. I look at a text like that and I think, yeah, that sounds a lot like the kind of thing that a person would get executed for, right? You don't go into Jerusalem and Passover, right, armed, and basically start a riot the day before, not expecting the Romans. Pontius Pilate is a horrifying nightmare of a person. The fact that he gets like baptized later and turns in, he becomes this sort of good guy in the end. He was a really horrible guy. The idea that Jesus would have gone into Jerusalem basically and had started a riot at that time of the year, at a time of a whole festival around liberation, tells me that whatever he was up to, he was certainly up to some political shenanigans, and his execution reflects that.
Yeah, well, I love you've like I said at the beginning, everything you're saying is giving me like 20 other questions. So I'm going to be doing some digging here before our next chat. Can I ask? I want to get into a big topic soon, but I have one final question. This is just like a off the top of my head question. Was there a name change happening with some of the things, like some of the places and names that we see? For example, some people have said the Apostle Paul was not Paul; it was someone else. Possibly someone like Simon Magus and so forth. Some people said the Essenes were, like when it says the Church of Jerusalem, that may have been the Essenes calling themselves that. Do you see name changes occurring in Judaism apart from Christianity, where people kind of are like, I don't know if it might be code words, or they're just like an initiation, like the people that know this real story, they know who we're talking about, or people may have covered up some names just to say, hey, this person had a bad reputation, so we're going to give it a new name, but we're really talking about this guy, the guy that caused trouble or whatever. Do you see the name change coming into the story at all with the origin of Christianity?
Good. I mean, there's definitely the case that that we have a good example is the Essenes, and the apocalyptic literature uses a lot of highly coded symbolic language.
Okay.
They're not going to refer to the Romans; they're going to refer to them as the Kittim, and we see that early on in even the Book of Daniel, I think, where Babylon is referred to as Shinar, and you have this coded language that develops. And certainly in the Book of Revelation, right? This, I think it's the beast 616, 666. This is almost certainly referring to Caesar, to Nero. And the early manuscripts have it as 616. The later manuscripts have it as 666. But if you count the letters, right, in Greek and in Hebrew, they come out to 616 and 666 respectively. So that's certainly the case. And again, the way that names got applied to things back in that time period is sometimes odd. The Essenes are a great example. The Essenes and all the documents that we've recovered from the Dead Sea Scrolls, we're talking about thousands of fragments, the word Essene never appears. They never call themselves that. They refer to themselves as the Yachad, as the community. And so they never call themselves the Essenes for some reason.
Interesting.
Which is just odd. Why do they not? Why is this a name that Philo knows, and so does Josephus, right? And it seems like that these people are the same people. But why do they never refer to? We're not even sure what the word Essene means. It's a very mysterious word just in general. No one's really quite sure what this word means. And again, the people at Qumran never refer to themselves once. That word never appears in any of their documents. Like did it with the Pharisees. Rabbis never call themselves that. Right? The Perushim, the separatists. You never really see them being referred to that, but clearly the New Testament really likes that language, and so does Josephus. He also uses that language.
Okay.
And also early Christianity, right? You have one of these early sort of Judaizing heresies, right? I don't have a dog in the fight of what's heretical and what's not. But one of these early Judaizing heretics, all right, are the Ebionim. They're part of what we know about them, I think, from Irenaeus, is that allegedly they were Jewish Christians, and that was not okay. Well, it just means the ones that are poor, the poor ones, and that's exactly the way that it's like James and those folks in Jerusalem refer to themselves. They refer to themselves as the poor. I think this is one time in the New Testament where Paul is actually raising money for the poor ones in Jerusalem, and I think he may have embezzled money, and he gets recalled to answer for where all this money went, which that would have been living a fly on the wall, that meeting. But yeah, I don't know. I don't know what these sort of name changes going on here with Saul and Paul. Lots of people back then had nicknames. Why exactly Saul's name is changed to Paul, I don't know. But do
you have any guesses as to who he really was?
Who Paul of Tarsus was?
Yeah. Do you think he was? Do you think that was his actual real name, or do you think that was just a pseudonym for something else?
So he's such a mysterious guy, isn't he? Right? We can't even really track the guy down. He seems to have this conversion moment, then he vanishes, and it's not even clear how he vanished. He goes into Arabia for In one text, it says he's gone for so many years. In one text, I think he's gone for 14 years or something.
Yeah.
Something like that. I can't remember the exact numbers exactly. I don't know. I don't know what to make of him. I think he was real. He knows a lot about Judaism. I mean, he does the right kind of name dropping, right? That he studies under these people and things like that. I don't think he was Simon Magus. I think that was a different story. I think that's a different kind of layer of something else. But yeah, I think he's, again, it's, I don't know.
I find it fascinating how he's so argumentative against the Jerusalem people. Like, in Galatians, it says he opposes Peter to his face because he was, being basically duplicitous, doing one thing among the Gentiles. And then when the Jewish leaders come, he's doing something different.
Right.
And so Peter says, anyone who's going to preach a different gospel, let him be anathema, let him be cursed. And it's interesting. He doesn't like. If it were true, and this is getting away from the whole history of it and just into this summer kind of speculating what happened, but if it were true, and if the disciples really had been with the real Jesus for 3 years, and you finally get this vision of this Christ, you would think that the very first thing you would do is you would run to the people and say, I've only seen him for 5 minutes. I talked to him for 5 minutes or whatever this vision was. You've actually eaten with him every day for 3 years. You walked with him in the hills, and you heard the parables, but you had the quiet moments with him on the path in between towns. What did you ask him? What did he say? What was he like? What did he look like? And it's like he doesn't even care about that. It's like, no, you guys are do your own thing. I'm doing mine. It doesn't make sense. You wouldn't. If that were real, you wouldn't do it that way.
It's odd, yeah, and of course, Paul never quotes Jesus, or quotes him basically once. Yep. And again, even the question of 3 years, right? That's in the Gospel of John, that we have this 3 year long period, where it looks like in the earlier Gospels, I think Jesus' ministry may have only lasted less than a year before he was executed. So it's not even clear how long he was active. I think the John story is much later and less reliable. I think he wasn't active for 3 years. Probably just for a year or so, or a little less than a year. But yeah, it is weird, right, that he has this vision. But he names these weird things that again tell me that that Paul knows something about esoteric Judaism. There's this, I think it's in Corinthians, right? This famous line where he says he knows a guy, right, that was taken up to the third heaven. Well, this entire genre of Jewish literature, the Merkava literature, that is exactly that. That is exactly. It's interesting that he says goes up because the Merkava literature always has people going down into the heavens, which is vertigo-inducing. What they descend into the chariot is the way that the Hebrew goes. Yerida, they go down into. They don't go. It's not aliyah. They yerida.
Is it like descending into heaven?
It's descending into heaven. Yeah, it's descending through the heavens, which is again a vertigo-inducing image. But the fact that Paul he mentions the fact that he was raptured into the third heaven, or exactly how the line goes there, that tells me that this guy, whoever he was, certainly Jewish, and certainly knew something about esoteric Judaism. And when you say something like that, it's sort of I know that you know that I know, it's kind of a kind of thing. And when I read that line and I think 2 Corinthians, I think it's where that is, 2 Corinthians 7. I don't have I'm
not sure as well.
I don't have my Bible memorized. I can quote. I can typically have a pretty good memory. I can typically know where these things are, but sometimes I just don't have them ready to hand. But that one line, to me, whoever wrote that letter, assuming it was Paul, tells me that he was engaged in some form of esoteric Judaism, and that the Merkava literature, what we know certainly existed at that time, was something he was practicing. And if he were practicing it, this sort of Merkava mysticism, that means he must have been well connected and an insider. He must have been someone, because this is not the kind of thing that non-initiates are going to be allowed into. And so the fact that he knew about that tells me that he must have been well connected at some level in the Jewish world with rabbinical authorities who are engaging in that kind of mystical practices.
So if he's having visions, and this goes into a little bit of Gnosticism and into Greek cosmology, but there's the the levels of heaven, above us. How are they mixing that? If there's levels of heaven above, but yet they're descending, I assume they're not meaning they're descending into the earth.
Yeah.
Like what? How are they ascending and descending? Like, are those two different descriptions of the same action, or are they totally different actions?
It's really confusing. I mean,
Okay.
The texts that survive are just perplexing, honestly. They're just really unusual. I always tell folks when I teach the Merkava literature, which some of it, a good bit of it does survive, that it's like reading ancient science fiction. It's like some of the most unusual literature, especially what is called the Shior Kuma literature, where literally you're not only given a vision of God's body, but you're actually allowed to measure the dimensions of God's body and parasangs and this unit of Persian and some of the most unusual literature.
I watched that video of yours. Was it like his beard is like 34,000 miles?
Yeah, something like this, right? The distance between God's eyebrows and things like this. Which again, for a religion that's really really resistant to the idea of God having a body, it's a very strange literature, to say the very least. So, to what degree are these speculations tying up to Greek the Greek cosmology? Probably a lot, because the old Israelite cosmology basically, right, was that the Earth was something like a flat disk that sat on top pillars that seemed to be the four pillars, and there's kind of a dome over the sky, right, and above that dome is basically water, and so the old Israelite cosmology that we have in the Hebrew Bible, and there's a sort of primordial deep with these sort of sea monsters that are there, and God sort of summons the world, the olam, the world out of that primordial deep, which is a very common. You see that in Egyptian mythology, and you see something like that also. The fact that the deep is the Tehom in Hebrew, the Tiamat, the sort of the sea goddess monster in Babylonian mythology. They come from the exact same root word in the Akkadian and Hebrew respectively.
Is that the same as the Leviathan?
Yeah, so Leviathan's probably the same kind of story, right? You have, and you see this, right? And that's in fact in the Book of Job, God brags. I mean, when all the things when God really wants to brag about how amazing God is, the thing that he brags about is, I destroyed Leviathan, and it's almost certainly, and I think it takes up several verses, and that the killing of Leviathan, or the fighting with Leviathan, clearly was part of a much older strata of Israelite theology. In fact, there's even a parallel creation story, I think, in Psalm 74, I think, where the sea monster battle is a much bigger part of that creation story. So people talk about the two creation stories in Genesis, and I was like, yeah, there's another one in Psalms too, that much more sea monster fighting oriented, which I always imagine is sort of Godzilla stuff, which I really like.
Yeah.
It's like God fighting with sea monsters. I just love that image.
Yeah.
So I think that when we get to these, we'll go back to the question of Paul for a moment. I think he certainly existed. I think that I think he's someone who is connected to this sort of Merkava mysticism. And the question is, how much of this Greek mythology or Greek cosmology is being imported? Well, a lot. Greek science was the leading science of the day, and this is in the first century. It would have been they would have been basically the authority on this kind of stuff. You're only a century out from the Almagest being written by Ptolemy. And so Greek ideas, Aristotelian ideas about these idea of the concentric crystalline spheres and stuff like that, these would have been somewhat well known. And again, you have this idea, right, of the world as sort of now shells going up.
Are those the aeons?
Yeah, these aeons. Yeah, there's aeons, and these are basically dominated by the planets, and every planet. And again, we have to keep in mind, right, that the Greeks and the ancient people did not understand these planets the way that we do. There's no ancient word for planet. They just called them stars that wander around. The word planestai just means to wander. They were just weird stars that behaved erratically. It's ditto, and there's no ancient Hebrew word for planet either. It's just star, and there's stars that wander and stars that don't. And these stars were thought of as intelligent. They were thought of as entities that were creatures of some kind. And evil, but typically, at least in the sort of classical Gnostic worldview, these are the Archons. These are demonic entities that live in the heavenly realm between.
So the stars
Earth.
are archons?
Yeah, the stars are something like archons. Yeah, they're these evil entities that live, and typically they're ever how many of them. The number ranges. Some Gnostic texts have up to 40 of them, and some typically have closer to 8. And then the outermost regions, right, is where God is. It's sort of beyond the universe and another realm. And the rabbis seem to have adopted some part of this kind of mythology with this Merkava mysticism, where you're actually ascending through the various levels of heaven. And if you read the Merkava literature, the Hechalot literature, these palaces, the Hechalot, the palaces, are sometimes referred to as treasuries in different texts. They're dominated by angels. They're angels that are living there. But again, you have to come to think that in the rabbinical imagination, angels are not the cuddly, naked little cherubs. These are terrifying entities, more than happy to kill you for trespassing. In fact, there's a story in one of the Hechalot, one of the literatures, the Hechalot literatures, where the rabbis are complaining actually that someone gave them the wrong passcode, and they went before this angel and they gave basically the wrong passcode, and they almost got killed. And it's this bizarre story where you're like, what are they talking about? Where they were supposed to say X, but they said Y, and this angel is so powerful, will kill you just by looking at you or whatever. Which seems to betray some practice, it mysteriously betrays some practice. But again, with this this idea of these various things kind of coming into Judaism, yeah, you're going to get some kind of syncretism, which is unsurprising, because it's simply impossible that Judaism as a religion is not going to see the enormous strides made in Greek science and Greek cosmology and incorporate some of those elements in, and we can see some of those being incorporated in to the Hechalot literature. And again, when I look at someone like Paul, it strikes me as someone who's engaged in this mysticism. And further, right, part of the aim of that mysticism is to have a glimpse of the divine throne. That's the whole aim of the mysticism. Right. And that's exactly what happens on the road to Emmaus at some level, is that Paul's given a glimpse of the divine Christ. And unsurprisingly, right, if he does practice this kind of mysticism, well, it'd be unsurprising that he doesn't get, a peek.
Yeah, but I know that we haven't dove into this yet, but the whole idea of the archons and some of these other concepts, they're woven into some of the literature, such as the Book of Enoch. What's your understanding of the Book of Enoch? How does it relate to what we're talking about right now? And also just a few minor questions to add to it. Who is, just for our understanding, who is Metatron? And I know you went into one of your videos about the idea that the Jews can do things to work against the power of the archons. I'm curious if you could touch on that. So how are they relating to these archons to kind of mitigate their threats? Who is Metatron? And then what does the Book of Enoch clarify about what they're thinking about all this?
Yeah, so there are 3 books of Enoch that have survived from antiquity. The first Book of Enoch is probably the most famous, which is also not one book itself, right? Really, the Book of Enoch is 5 or 6 separate books that have been sort of stitched together, sometimes cool and sometimes not. And a big part of those books is cosmology stuff. It's sort of Enoch being given a tour of the various the structure of the cosmos.
And that was before the time of Christianity, correct?
Yeah, Enoch. We think Enoch was probably written. There's debate about it, but sometime probably the 3rd century BCE.
Okay.
It was probably edited together as we know it now.
So this had a long. I mean, we're talking not even decades, but centuries, where this was permeating a lot of, not everybody's sectarian view of Judaism, but a lot of the Jews that would be more esoteric and mystical about it. This would have been absolutely the bread butter.
Oh yeah, I mean, the Book of Enoch was no doubt very popular. Again, among certain Jews. I think among other Jews it was not popular. For instance, the rabbinical Judaism is not terribly interested in the first Book of Enoch. Okay. They're much more interested in the 2nd and 3rd books of Enoch, which are part of the Hechalot Merkava literature. But in the what do we know about the first book? Well, we know that the first Book of Enoch was popular. For instance, at the Dead Sea Scrolls, we find more copies of the Book of Enoch than we find some copies of books of Torah. So there are
Wow,
more, there are more copies
that's surprising.
yeah, it's one of these weird things where you there are lots of copies of Jubilees and lots of copies of Enoch. I think I can't remember the exact number, but there's certainly more copies of the Book of Enoch than there are copies of the Book of Leviticus, which is interesting because that the group of folks out there at Qumran are very interested in ritual purity. They were probably founded by renegade sort of protest movement against the Jerusalemite priesthood. They were themselves probably priests, and certainly they thought of themselves as priests. So the Book of Leviticus would have been incredibly important to them. There are more copies of Enoch than Leviticus. The New Testament quotes Enoch once, right? The book of and the letter of Jude, the Book of Enoch is quoted there. So we know.
Well, can I just add? I've been studying the Book of Enoch. It's actually quoted a lot more than that. It's quoted, from what I can tell, it's quoted between 50 and 100 times. I'm still adding it up. But it looks like the New Testament's literally dozens of times that it quotes the Book of Enoch.
Yeah, I've seen different people like how exactly, because we don't have a copy of Enoch in Greek, and so the question is
Right.
we have to kind of reconstruct exactly what would have been quoted. But yeah, at any rate, it was popular. The Book of Enoch was certainly a thing that was read, especially among apocalyptic Jews. And so that structure, that worldview, in fact, also the calendar that's described in the Book of Enoch is very similar to the one that was used at Qumran. So not they're even keeping time in a sort of Enochic way out there at Qumran. The Essenes may have been, in some sense, a kind of Enochian version of Judaism. There's even sort of interesting versions where some people even argued that there's a kind of Mosaic Judaism that's very legally oriented, and there's kind of an Enochian apocalyptic Judaism, and they were basically going their own separate ways, and that Christianity is much more on that Enochian side of the equation.
Yeah,
I'm not sure I would go that. So I'm not sure I would go that far. But yeah, the Book of Enoch was incredibly popular. Again, it had been around for centuries by the time Christianity emerged. The writers, at least some of the writers of the New Testament, certainly knew the book quite well. We know that the stories there. So we have the book of the Watchers and things like that. These ideas of the Nephilim and stuff. Those stories were very around at the time of Jesus and the time of the rabbis of that era and later. So you're talking about a book that was incredibly popular but fell off. For instance, rabbinical Judaism ultimately rejected its authority, and we don't have a copy that we have only fragments of copies that survive. In Hebrew, none survive outside, I think, of the Dead Sea Scrolls. In fact, the only copies we have that survive are in Ethiopic. It's the Ethiopian Jews or the Ethiopian Christians preserved it.
they preserved it really well, though, didn't they? From what I've read.
Yeah, it's in great shape. Yeah, their editions are in pretty good shape. I think that there are a couple minor fragments here and there.
Well, could I ask, as we're painting this picture, there's this question that comes up to a lot of mythicists. So you have Paul writing first. He doesn't talk about Jesus preaching the Sermon on the Mount, preaching sermons on the hills. He doesn't talk about the Virgin Mary. He doesn't talk about the parables. Jesus talks all the time in parables. Paul doesn't mention it. It almost looks to a lot of people like the Gospels are euhemerizing. They're bringing a history in that wasn't originally there. And Paul's talking about, I saw him first with a vision. I then had, other visions. He talks in Colossians about don't get, puffed up about, the worship of the angels that you're seeing. He's talking all this mystical stuff about visions. And in this context where you're painting this picture of, Enoch, the levels of heaven, people believing that they're having visions. They're literally doing these passcodes to get to the levels. They're seeing the different emanations and so forth, the different aeons. And they're talking, about trying to, fight against the Archons, but get through the levels of with the good angels that would let you through if you say the right words. And the question comes up, how do we really know that this Jesus character was was actually real. And where it gets interesting, and I know this is not your specialty, so I'm not trying to paint you into a definite, I think this versus that. I'm just curious of your ideas. But when you look at the Gospels, you say, okay, well, how much can we rely on them? Because if they're reliable, then that's a big argument. But as you look at them, they fall apart in many, many, many ways. Number one, there's a huge amount of contradictions, where they're literally like correcting each other, telling different stories. But then in addition to that, you have the issue of the Midrash, where they're rewriting Old Testament stories, like, this was Joshua, here's the better Joshua. Here's Adam, here's the better Adam. There's all these stories that are kind of being just rewritten from the Old Testament. So that's suspicious right up front. And then you get this idea of the Greek influence, such as the Homeric and Euripides, where the Iliad and the Odyssey are basically being rewritten. So Jesus is the better Odysseus, and you can literally see like whole passages that are exactly like, this is what happens in Homer. And it's almost like the whole structure and even some of the words are right from Homer in the New Testament. And you're like, you're rewriting the Iliad and the Odyssey. It's like, okay, that doesn't look like it's necessarily very historical. And then you add into it some of the stuff which we talked about last time offline about astrotheology, where some of this stuff looks really suspiciously like you're telling a story about the stars, where you have and some of it correlated directly with Greek mythology, but the two sons of thunder, which the two disciples that are known as sons of thunder, saying, should we call down fire from heaven to destroy these people who didn't obey, didn't listen to the gospel or whatever it was. Well, that's directly, that's Castor and Pollux, and they're sons of thunder, and they did that. They would call down fire from heaven. And it's like you end up between the Greek mythology, the Greek epics, the fact that Paul isn't quoting this stuff, you end up with this question where it's like, this has a good chance of not being even real at all. Not to say that there couldn't have been a guy in someone's mind, but you know a lot more about a lot of these subjects than I do, and even will for years. What's your impression when you hear people suggest that as a possibility, that this guy was truly pure mythology?
Right. This is Richard Carrier's argument, right? This is
Richard Carrier, Dr. Price, and David Fitzgerald. Yeah,
a couple of these folks. Yeah. What do I think about that? My general sense is that when I look at the Gospels, there are obviously accretions that are happening with that story being told and retold and retold. I like the miracles sometimes, right? One of my favorite version, I think, is in the early miracles, Jesus has to like spit into the mud and then physically apply it, and then by the Gospel of John, he just has to walk past their house. And those miracles, it's sort of like your uncle fishing story, right? The fish goes, and clearly you can see things like that happening in the Gospels, to me at least. When I look at the character of Jesus, what I'm basically seeing as an apocalyptic preacher that was very probably similar to lots of apocalyptic preachers who obviously was very charismatic and basically I think got himself killed. And when I look at Jesus, I see an exorcist primarily. That's one of the main things that I'm seeing. Like, look at almost half of his miracles are exorcism related miracles,
which would fall into the category of magic of an early Jewish magician.
Right.
Okay.
Right. And we have characters like that and from the Galilee, right? The two main examples, Jesus is somewhat sandwiched between them. We have Choni, the circle maker, who was famous as a kind of theurgist. He could he would draw. The famous story, right, is he would draw a circle and he could force God basically to make it rain. He could force the hand of God in some ways. And the rabbis did not like this. Many rabbis wanted to have him excommunicated for using basically magical powers to make it rain, and this idea that you shouldn't force God to do things. This is sort of a weird twisting God's arm thing. It's not okay. Of course, he's completely fine now in Judaism. In fact, I've been to his grave. I've prayed at his grave, which is considered a high thing to do. There's a funny story that I can tell you if you want, but
yeah, please.
My wife, her favorite rabbi is Choni the circle maker, and it's funny. We were driving in Israel. And we were visiting the grave of Maimonides, and I happened to get a flat tire, and I had to get the tire fixed. And the nearest place was at Chatzor, and happened to be the same place that Choni the circle maker is buried. And so, of course, if we were a bit more superstitious, we would say that, the tire had gotten flattened so that we would go to the tire place where Choni the Circle Maker's kever, his grave, is, so we could go.
And it's ironic, the tire is a circle.
The tire is a circle, yeah, exactly. It all comes together. So Choni the Circle Maker is now considered revered in Judaism. There's not a spot on him. And the other guy is
Can I ask real quick before you tell the next side? Are there records of people observing him do his magic, where people said yes, he drew a circle and it did rain 5 minutes later?
Yeah, so you have the story in the rabbinical literature, and you also have the same story in Josephus. So you have a similar story in Josephus. I think the story of him doing the circle thing is in Josephus. I know it's reported several times in the rabbinical literature, and they're reported in not a nice way. It's not flattering. They don't like that he did this.
But they admit that he did.
They admit that he did, yeah. And he's also he's recorded in Josephus as well. So
that's fascinating.
So I think he probably existed, and he probably did some kind of magic, and he'd do a circle, and maybe it rained at the same time. I don't know.
Yeah. He deceived people some way that they thought it was real.
Whatever how magic works. Far be it from me to say it doesn't or say it does. My general attitude is like, this is the story. What we have is a story. We have the narrative, and then we have Jesus, of course, right? Who's again a Galilean. His cousin is this baptizer guy who's obviously probably some kind of ascetic, Essene type character, which we have lots of evidence that they existed. Who also gets himself killed. And it looks like Jesus' earliest followers are probably from this Yochanan, the baptizer guy. I think that Jesus, he basically picks up doing his cousin's work at some level. He's famous as a healer and an exorcist. We have another character very similar to Jesus who lived just about 10 or 15 years after Jesus, is Hanina ben Doza, who we have very similar stories of him doing exorcisms, of him engaging in all kinds of magical practices, also from the Galilee. And of course, the other guy that's crucially important in all this is Shimon Bar Yochai, another Galilean miracle worker who famously also hated the Romans. Allegedly, the Romans tried to kill him, and he hid in a cave for several years. And allegedly, he could shoot lasers out of his eyes and burn things up. He had all these sort of magical powers as well. And of course, he's attributed to the authorship of the important Jewish mystical text, the Zohar, which is the backbone of the Kabbalah. So the fact that you would have someone like Jesus, who would be basically an apocalyptic anti-Roman preacher who's engaging in these sort of quasi-magical practices like exorcism and healing, the fact that the idea that he didn't exist would be weird, considering we have so many other guys like him.
Right.
That would be my way of looking at it. From when I look at I'm like, of course he existed. There were 50 of those guys. It just so happens that he got himself killed, and maybe precisely because of Paul. Because I think had it not been for Paul, I think Christianity would have been dead. I think it would have died. I don't think it would have survived the Bar Kokhba rebellion. Basically, I think Jewish Christianity was basically annihilated in the Bar Kokhba rebellion. Had it not been for Paul, then the religion would have died. But the idea that you would have this miracle working apocalyptic rabbi with a political bent who managed to get himself killed, I think there were a dozen of those guys.
Right. So even if he's mythologized, it's still very plausible that there was a guy.
It was the guy, Jesus of Nazareth. And again, I think that they have to change the story to make him from Bethlehem, right? I don't think he was originally from Bethlehem. I think there's every reason to believe he was from Nazareth. But they need him to come from Bethlehem. And I got the Gospels can't quite make up their mind how to trace his lineage to get him to go back to David. So they do it through Joseph, and they're like, hold on, he's from the virgin birth. So we have to monkey it with it and make him through Mary, but you can't trace genealogy through Mary in that way. And so, you see for me, right, I see the accretions that are going on in the first, 30, 40, 50 years of this narrative. And those accretions are accretions onto something, in my opinion. And that something was this apocalyptic character.
Well, can I throw this in? You're seeing a lot of stuff in the Book of Enoch, and I think the Essential of Isaiah and other places where it's like they're weaving certainly probably some history or a seed of kernel of history, but they're weaving a lot of things that you would look at and say, no, that's definitely not real. Like I remember, I think it was Dr. Carey you were talking about. There's a book that talks about Adam was buried, I believe, either on the moon or somewhere up in space. And there were sects of Jews that literally believed that Adam was Adam was buried up in space. and either on Mars, the moon, or something. And so you have people weaving in an incredible amount of, very fascinating, but very clearly mythology, and very esoteric mythology. Do you think that's possibly what's happening here, especially when you're bringing, like you mentioned, the Zodiac is in some of the synagogues. People had a huge astrotheological perspective. I guess I'm just asking, do you think that they were trying to weave him into those stories? Do you think he was part of the fulfillment of some of the stuff in the Book of Enoch, where maybe there was a guy, whether he was really that important in history or not, there was potentially a guy in people's minds, but it seems like they were quickly trying to use him to fulfill a lot of stories that may have been very astrotheological, that may have been related to Enoch and these levels of heaven. Do you think that's possible? I guess.
I think, yeah. So I think what I would say is there's the question of whether Jesus was a historical person. That to me is, I think that he on the balance. I'm not going to do a statistical analysis that Carrier does and say yeah or nay. I don't have those tools available to me, I guess, and I don't have a dog in that fight to that degree, I guess.
Right.
There's the question of who Jesus was, and there's the question of what Jesus meant. And what Jesus meant clearly was never settled. It was not settled. It took centuries for them to settle that question. And that if you want to answer the question of what does Christ mean, what does Jesus mean, then obviously what's going to happen, right, is that the Jewish folks and eventually the Greek folks that are going to be telling that story are going to be pulling on all the available tools that they have in order to make Jesus mean what they want him or need him to mean. And I tell folks, right, when I teach, for instance, Greek philosophy, the Trinity is the classic example of this. The Trinity is basically impossible without the apparatus of all the enormity of all of Greek philosophy. The system just doesn't make sense without the apparatus of Greek philosophy to talk about substance and homoousios and all this stuff. And so they brought to bear Greek philosophy to make this work, to make this theology work, which everyone who's inventing a theology is going to bring to bear whatever cultural systems and cultural data they have to make it work, whether you're a Judean or a Greek or a Zambian or Maya or whatever. And so that that an apocalyptic leader would basically, that people who followed an apocalyptic leader would use apocalyptic texts to make sense of what had just happened is not only, it's the only possible answer, right? There's just nothing else. What are they going to lean on?
Yeah.
Right. So of course they're going to look to texts like Enoch. They're going to look to texts like the Ascension of Isaiah. They're going to look to texts, and there's these weird ideas. And again, even what Messiah was in this time period is not settled. The rabbi, even by the time of the Babylonian Talmud, even to now, it's not a settled issue about what Messiah is, how many Messiahs there are going to be. There very clearly was an idea early on in Judaism that there were going to be two, at least two. One of them was going to die. There's going to be a priest Messiah that was going to die. And then there's going to be a Davidic Messiah that was going to come after and sort of mop everything up. And so even what Messiah meant at this time was not settled. And so when early Christians want to make sense of this Jesus movement, this Jesus business, this Christ business, of course they're going to bring to bear the apparatus that they have access to. And that apparatus is largely going to be the backbone of Hellenistic ideas, Hellenistic philosophy, of the kinds of ideas that we'll see emerging in Greek philosophy eventually as well, with the Logos. And then, of course, with the entire apparatus of things like the Merkabah literature and other forms of esoteric Judaism, which again shouldn't. I find it interesting, right? That maybe it's because I'm not Christian, and so I don't have a dog in the fight. That what seems to me to be perfectly obvious when I mention to other people, they're like, that's not a thing. It's not possible. That's not. And I'm like, what else would they have? How else would they have constructed it?
Yeah.
What other tools would they have had access to? So.
Well, that's the fascinating thing is, as a Christian, I mean, I went to Bible college to be a pastor. I had memorized, huge sections of the Bible, verse by verse, and I never heard any of this stuff. Either stuff from people like Dr. Carrier, Dr. Bob Price, Dr. David Fitzgerald, stuff like that, just about the the mythicist position, but even just the other books, the 40 plus other gospels, even not even the Jewish books, just the other, Jewish Christian books, the many other gospels, the other books of Acts, they never talk about it. And then when you bring it up to people, they're like, what are you talking about? Like, that has nothing to do with Christianity. And you're like, it has everything to do with Christianity.
Right,
And it's they don't know what to do with it. They're floored.
right, because there just wasn't a Christianity, and there
Right.
never has been, and there just won't be. Just like there's never been a Judaism or a Islam or whatever, a Confucianism. Christianities existed from the very get-go, and how those Christianities internally made sense to themselves, how they made them make sense to themselves, is going to be the long-term trajectory of how these different sects of Christianity are going to emerge.
And some just won out. They argue, but some had bigger voices.
Yeah, sure. And some of them I think just actually make better sense. Sometimes people will often ask me, what do I think, for instance, about the Gnostics? And the Gnostic, this is a difficult category, and there's some reasons to believe that there's some reasons to maybe not use this term in a technical way.
Yeah.
But I'm like, I think that there's a reason why the proto-Orthodoxy beat the Gnostics. I think the Gnostics just have a bad worldview. I think they have an inconsistent worldview that doesn't make a lot of sense, and it doesn't really speak to the human experience. And I think that when I read the proto-Orthodox folks, and again, I don't have a dog in this fight, but when I read people like Athanasius, they make a lot more sense to me. They're logically more consistent. They're more rigorous. Their theories, as much as, again, I don't really agree with them or whatever, but they just, if I needed something to cover the data, Athanasius is doing a way better job than Valentinus. And so I think that there's reasons why some of these heretical sects died off. They just actually weren't competitive. And when I look at someone like Augustine, who's clearly an incredibly thoughtful, hardworking, genius, really, it's not surprising that this guy carries the day. And because in the marketplace of ideas, often one hopes good ideas and solid argumentation are going to do it. And when I read The City of God, this is a much more impressive piece of philosophy than when I read the Apocryphon of John with all of its strange levels and archons and things like that. It's good science fiction at some level, but when I compare the two, I'm like, well, it's pretty clear to me why Orthodoxy, why what we now call Orthodoxy won the day.
Yeah, and you add in Constantine, and it becomes even clearer.
Right.
I was curious. You mentioned the word Kabbalah a little bit ago, and we're winding down to the last few questions here. But what is Kabbalah? When did it start? And did that possibly have any effect on the early Christianity timeframe that we're talking about?
Yeah. So now typically what's unfortunately happened is that sort of Kabbalah is now used as a blanket term for Jewish mysticism. I would typically reserve Kabbalah for the form of Jewish mysticism that emerged in the aftermath of the 13th century. So the 13th century, the Common Era, with the rise of the books like the Zohar and the Sefer Bahir, and the kind of Jewish mysticism, the theosophical mysticism that emerged in relationship to those texts.
So long after the origins of Christianity.
Yeah, many centuries after. So, but that's not to say that Jewish mysticism didn't exist prior to that. That we've been talking about the Merkava and the Hechelot literature and the Shior Koma literature and other forms of mysticism that certainly existed way back. I think those forms of mysticism certainly had some impact on early Christians, Paul being the one we mentioned most clearly. So I think that the Kabbalah is a much later development. Now, it does have a huge impact in many ways on the development of Renaissance Christianity, which is a completely different story. Right. But you have people like Marsilio Ficino and Pico and Johannes Reuchlin, where they're actually going to Jewish mysticism to find the truth of Christianity, which is a really interesting thing to do, especially as a kind of, especially in the light of the rise of Protestantism, and you have these sort of proto-Protestants who are really interested in Judaism and Jewish mysticism as a way of proving the truth of Christianity. Guillaume Postel and John Dee and these kinds of people like this who are fascinating. But no, Kabbalah is a much later development in Jewish mysticism that incorporated a lot of this ancient stuff, but is a much later Spanish, French form of mysticism that develops in the Middle Ages.
The origins of the Kabbalistic Jewish mysticism. What books would you say that you originally started from, and were any of them pre-Christianity?
So Kabbalah specifically.
Yeah.
So the main books that are sort of the main early books of Kabbalah are going to be the Sefer Zohar, which was written in the late 13th century, the Sefer Bahir, which was written sometime before that, but we don't know when, sometime in the Middle Ages. And another book, a very mysterious little book called the Sefer Yetzirah, the Book of Formation, that was written sometime 7th, 8th centuries. No one really knows.
And would they have said, "Oh, we're actually still doing real Judaism, and it goes back to such and such"?
Oh, for sure. I mean, so for instance, the Sefer Zohar, the main book of the book that's the backbone of the Kabbalah, is claimed to have been written by Shimon Bar Yochai, who of course lived way back in the Galilee in the 2nd century.
Okay.
Scholars don't think that. Academic scholars do not think that Shimon Bar Yochai wrote the Sefer Zohar. There are Orthodox Jews that certainly believe that he did. We now typically think that it was written primarily by a guy named Moshe de Leon and people around him, sort of a collective writing project there in Spain in the 13th century, late 13th century. So Kabbalistic ideas are coming much, much later, but earlier forms of Jewish mysticism, like the Merkava mysticism, survived. I mean, we're talking about Kabbalah gets the it's the byword for Jewish mysticism now, but the Merkava mysticism lasted for 800 years. We still see these texts being copied and reproduced all the way into medieval Germany.
When would that have started? The
So
literature?
the Merkava, we typically think of the Merkava mysticism beginning maybe as far back as Ezekiel, the vision that Ezekiel had. It seems that kind of that's building a bridge between the prophetic literature, the apocalyptic literature, and what will become the Merkava literature. So these early Merkava texts would be something like the Ezekiel theophany, but also the vision of Isaiah that Isaiah has of the divine throne. Some people also think is an early form of Merkava mysticism.
Is that the wheel within a wheel one?
That's in Ezekiel, yeah. The so-called Ophanim, these wheel angels covered in eyes, which are very unusual. People say that they want to see an angel, but I don't think you want to see any angels from the Hebrew Bible. They're positively terrifying. I would not want to see anything like that. And so then we have the Merkavad literature developing from the Enochic literature, right? This sort of apocalyptic literature that emerges. And then we have the earliest texts, specific texts we have in, for instance, 2nd and 3rd Enoch. And we're going to mention Metatron, right? It's in that text that Enoch is transformed from being a human being into being this sort of angelic entity, Metatron, who is very mysterious. This entity Metatron appears pretty early in around the same time period as Jesus. And what exactly he is isn't clear. There's some reason to believe, good reason to believe, that there was a sect of Judaism that sort of thought that he was a kind of lesser god. In fact, there's even a place in, I think, 2nd Enoch or 3rd Enoch, where Metatron is actually referred to as Adonai Katan, like the little Adonai. The text literally says Yod Vafe Katan, like it's the lesser Yahweh. And one becomes, and then we know that there was a heresy that existed in the rabbinical world called the Two Powers in Heaven heresy, where the most famous heretic I mentioned earlier, Elisha ben Abuya, there's a story, a very obscure story in the Talmud where he ascends into the Pardes, into the heavens, and he sees Metatron sitting on the throne of God and declares that there are two powers in heaven. And he's both Metatron is punished and Elisha ben Abuya is excommunicated for this heresy. So it seems like they were Jews who believed in the idea that there were two divinities, maybe a Deus absconditus, a kind of hidden deity, and then an apparent deity that took the form of this entity, Metatron. But even what Metatron means, the word's not Aramaic, it's not Hebrew, kind of sounds like Greek. But this being emerges in the apocalyptic literature and really goes into Jewish literature through the Middle Ages and has divine-like powers, is a kind of revealed God. And so again, we have this idea of people becoming transformed into divine beings. And so again, the idea that that early Christians would have access to the idea of someone being converted from a physical existence into a divine existence. Christians certainly had access to that kind of literary technology, and having Jesus being transformed into a kind of God, that would have, I think, many Jews would have been like, yeah, that's what happened to Enoch. Happened to Jesus.
It's already on the agenda.
Yeah, like you're knocking on an open door. Like, yeah.
It's fascinating to me how you're painting a picture that, like, I find it amazing how the story of who God is and his identity changes so much, because like part of what got me out of Christianity was digging into the early origins of the God character, where you have, to most Christians it's one God. It's Yahweh, and he's got different names like Adonai or Elohim, but it's the same God. When you dig into it, you find out, oh no, there was the father figure Elyon, the son Yahweh, the wife Asherah, and there's this whole family, which is parallel to Greek mythology, had family and all those different crazy stories about the families doing crazy things, and
divine family drama
affairs, and all that, murders. But it's like it gets merged into, all right, we're going to take all these little stories and merge them. It's just Yahweh, nothing else. There's no father, son, there's no wife to anybody. It's just Yahweh. And then it's like you go on long enough and eventually it kind of splinters again. And it's like we bring in these demigods, which isn't surprising, especially in light of the, between the Egyptian and the Greco-Roman influence and other cultures. It's like that, they had people all over the place saying there's a lot of different gods, and gods are families. And there are, especially with the Greeks, there's emanations. And it's fascinating how it just keeps on evolving. And from a Christian perspective, it's like, okay, so all these stories keep on changing. Finally, right smack in the the middle of them is this, not necessarily the middle, but somewhere in there is the story of Jesus. And it's like we got to beg the question or ask for special pleading. Like, we don't believe this one, we don't believe that one, we don't believe this one, but this one right here, we're going to smack dab. That's the one we're going to stick with. And then it changes again. We're going to ignore those. And it's an amazing story of how this story evolves. And it's kind of fascinating too, where I love to do like a post-mortem to say, okay, regardless of how it happened, what people were thinking, blah, blah, blah. There's something about human nature that, like, it's fascinating to think, why did we as humans want to do this? Like, why did we want to make it so mysterious? Why do we want to look up in the heavens? And obviously part of it is just, the stars fascinate us. We love, the glory of the stars above us. But it's amazing to try to think about how, like, why did this have to happen this way? I mean, do you have do you ever step back from it all and just, apart from the details of it and what you would teach or study or read about, like, what does this take away about what humans tend to do with their stories?
Yeah, I think about why would human beings invent gods or whatever. Why would we invent these things? I guess there are lots of reasons that jump to my mind. I think the first is that that we live in a very cushy world right now, mostly, right? Us in North America, we live in a really cushy world, and chaos is not something we have to deal with too much. Not real chaos, right? And it's not surprising to me that most of these early mythologies are about the conquest of chaos, because we don't really have to deal with chaos, really, with real chaos anymore. And I think that because we don't have to deal with chaos much anymore, we take for granted just how lucky we have it. And so part of it, I think that if there's a God, even if those gods are capricious, or even if they're somewhat, even sometimes malevolent, there's a sense that they're in control. And I think psychologically, I think many people would rather have the idea that there's someone in control, even if they're not totally reliable. It's better that than chaos, right? Yeah. Better that than chaos. I think that's part of it. And also, I think that it's a perfectly legitimate question to ask, that the principle of sufficient reason. Things don't happen for no reason. Things have to have a cause. Everything that exists has been caused by something. And so it's a natural question just to look around and go, well, what caused all this? And well, the best thing going right is that human beings seem to be the ones that cause stuff. And so there's something like a person that caused all this. So it's a good theory. I think it's a perfectly reasonable theory. I don't know that I need that theory or accept it, but it's certainly reasonable. And again, when we go back to the question of the development of the Israelite God, this is part of the reason why I belong to the section of the Judaism that I do, is that I also clearly see that this character is evolving. And it's still evolving now, right? Look at for instance, we mentioned earlier the development of the Kabbalah. with the Kabbalah, you have the development of this system of the Sephirot, this 10 different emanations of the divine. And it's funny that when that idea first emerged, there were many Jews who said, look, the Christians have it bad enough that they made God into 3, but you guys are making God into 10, right? You're even worse than the Christians. Why would you do this? And so
is that the thing where they have like a whole? I've seen that Kabbalistic picture. Is that what?
Yeah, the so-called the tree of life. Yeah,
okay.
These emanations of God, which again, what exactly they are. Kabbalists argue a lot about exactly what those things are and how they relate to God. And are they God, or what exactly they are? But yeah, this idea of God is an evolving concept, and I love looking at the Hebrew Bible and seeing that this character is clearly evolving even there, where even monotheism is something that is developing in the text, right? When the Hebrew Bible asks, Micha mocha be'elim Adonai, right? Who is like you among the gods, O Yahweh? They're not. It's not a rhetorical question. They really do believe in other gods. They're just saying it's like the equivalent of like my dad can beat up your dad. It's that, but theological.
Yeah.
And you see that developing, and it's not until Isaiah, right, where you get this sort of, or third Isaiah rather, where you get this really hardcore monotheism. And what's interesting is it's a monotheism that is so radical that I think that Judaism and Christianity and Islam never really accepted, where you have the idea where God says, Ani tov v'ra, ani or v'choshech, I am good and evil, I am light and dark. There's no evil entity in that mythology. God is responsible for everything. And that was so intolerable that you now get the development of things like the devil and Satan, and because we don't want the idea of God doing evil things to us.
Yeah.
So, and even in the rabbinical literature, there's a prayer where that exact line in Isaiah is quoted during the Jewish liturgy to this day. And the rabbis changed it. They actually changed it from I am the good and the evil to I am the good and everything. Well, they're uncomfortable, theologically uncomfortable with the idea that God is responsible for evil. And so I see that those developments, for me, they don't disrupt my ability to be Jewish. They actually allow me to appreciate the patchwork quilt that is this religious civilization that I happen to have been born into. Yeah. And so it makes me actually appreciate it more than, at least for me, I appreciate it more to see how it developed, and I see the creativity involved in that development. And again, if I think of our Christian, and this may be how perhaps you and I would respond to these issues differently, is that I would become, I think, even more enthusiastically Christian because of out of respect and of the enormous creativity on the part of early Christians to make this Jesus thing make sense. Yeah. And I think that the one way of dealing with it, right, is like, oh, they just invented a bunch of mythology and I don't want to believe in, this is not worthy of belief. And I think maybe that my response would be that it in some level, I don't know if it's worthy of belief, but it would make me, in some sense, even more happy to be a Christian because of how creative and how thoughtful. I'm very envious often when rabbinical theology is not very highly developed. When I look to the debates of, the apostolic fathers and the church fathers and these debates around the Trinity and stuff, I'm like, wow, this is really good philosophy. Yeah. And so, yeah, I find the mythologizing aspect of the development of Christianity not a knock against it, but actually as a thing that I'm very in awe of the enormous creativity on the part of Christians to develop it. And I think that one, for me, and the way that I would want to frame it is that they're frauds or that they're making up things, or it's even pious fraud, even that kind of idea. Joseph Smith discovering the gold tablets in New York or whatever, people were like, oh, that's ridiculous. Why would anyone believe that? And I'm like, people, it's a great story. People like good stories. And I'm in awe of Joseph Smith for developing the theology behind the Latter-day Saints.
Yeah, it is amazing. What I was going to ask, I know we've gone a long time here, but it's two final questions. Sure. You deal a lot with amazing topics, some of the stuff we've talked about, but you deal as well with things like with magic, a lot of issues with different scrolls, even magic words and ciphers. We haven't really touched too much on gematria, the number codes, and you talk a lot about that and all these different things. But my two final questions were, do you ever get just amazed and stunned at humanity's desire to know, to have secrets, and to be like, like it's almost like like an evolution of tribalism. Like God is for us, he's picked us, we're his children, you're not. And so it's like tribalism starts that way, very, very much just like almost like a military thing. Like, God's going to help our armies defeat your armies. This is our land and we're going to defend it. But then it's like it evolves into, God has given us special books and he hasn't given them to you. So it's not just the land now, it's books. And then it becomes like, especially with mystery cults and early Christianity and some of this other stuff with the Merkavah, it's like God has given us not just books that we can all read, but he's given some of us these magical insights, mysteries, and some of them you're going to have to study for decades to even begin to get the understanding of it, if at all, and if at all on this side of heaven. And do you ever just sit back and does that ever hit you like, wow, we as a culture, as humans, just we love secrets and we love the fact that we know them, the other people don't, and it's like this. It's like it's kind of like a bad thing. It's like it's constant. We're in the club and you're not, which is, I don't in any way want to admire that, but in another sense, it's like it's still we have to acknowledge it's a big part of who we are. We love the secrets, and that's it. Across culture, religions, we're all doing it. And then on that note, my question added to that was just, what are you studying? Like, what's coming up next? What's on your radar that you haven't even brought up yet on these lines or similar? Because I feel like I'm kind of waiting to see what else you're diving into.
Yeah, I guess the question with secrets is always interesting to me, because secrets are always a weird thing. We like the idea of knowing a secret, but it's weird in the sense that simply knowing a secret is insufficient. You have to have other people know that you know the secret. Yeah. And so in many ways, it's the having of the secret that's more important than the content of the secret itself. And so often when you look at some of these hidden texts, you look at them and you're like, that was the secret? Really? Like, that was the whole thing? And it's the having of the secret that makes people feel special or initiated or Gnostic, that they have this special wisdom about the nature of reality that allows them to escape it. I think that it really comes down to this idea that we live again in a world that is, especially in the ancient world, that was beset by enormous amounts of chaos. And the desire that underneath the chaos, there's some secret solution to all the problems. And that's not unique to ancient religions. I think you see this sometimes in like utopian political thinking as well. There's just, if we just did X, we just got rid of the Federal Reserve or something, right? Which everything will be fine. Or you see people that make these kind of arguments. They have the secret knowledge of everything. QAnon, I think, is another great example of this same thing, right? We know the secret about what President Trump is really doing, and and they form a community. The community, the Flat Earth Society people also, right? It's many of them, I think. Yeah, it's about this community business. Mm-hmm. So, sometimes I'm amazed that human beings will go to such lengths to have access to this secret knowledge and things like that. And it's not surprising at some level, because human beings want to feel special. We all want to feel like we have the inside track, and we all feel like we know the secrets of how the universe works. And there's some part of me that, while I find it very fascinating, I also find I'm very leery of that impulse. Yeah. It's a fundamentally anti-democratic impulse. It's a non-cosmopolitan impulse. And I worry, right, about that. And it's one of these funny things where we typically think of mystics as being kind of far out there, people believing in very strange kinds of things. And we typically now think of mysticism as being somehow inherently politically progressive, right? The sort of spiritual, witchy people are often also politically progressive, but historically that's not the case. Jesus, for instance, right? If you look at Jesus, the few times that he speaks on Jewish law, he's almost always more conservative than even the most conservative rabbis of his day, right? With the exception of the Sabbath. But for instance, Jesus doesn't seem to allow for divorce like that. Like, it's in that position is unimaginable in rabbinical Judaism. Like, of course you can get divorced. And in many cases, he's more conservative, right? And if you look at many mystics through history, holding on to the secrets makes them more conservative, more tribalistic. I think of some of the medieval mystics who were the most enthusiastic about the Crusades. And I'm like, this impulse I worry about. I worry about what it means about us, and I worry about this desire for the have and the have-nots to also occur at the spiritual level and occur at the level of religious insight. And this is part of the reason I really like rabbinical Judaism, is that when you read rabbinical Jewish texts, they're a debate. And you go read the Talmud, you're not reading a law code, you're reading a bunch of guys in a room debating. And often the debates aren't settled, right? And Judaism is a history of that debate. And it's the history of that debate going forward. And every generation has to continue that debate. In Reconstructionism, we have a saying, right, that tradition gets a vote, not to veto. But the only way that the tradition can have a vote is if you go study it and study it deeply.
Yeah.
And so that debate continues, even, for instance, if I use my computer on the Sabbath. The question is, if I'm breaking is it really the case that chashmal is electricity? And is it really the case that that's chashmal is fire? And is it really the case that I'm debating this? So at any rate, the secret stuff, I'm leery of that impulse. I don't trust it. And it's funny because when I say that I don't trust that impulse, people often will email me from the channel, and they'll shoot me an email and be like, so what's the real story? What's the real, tell me I want to sign up to your secret thing where I can learn the secrets. I'm like, I don't have them, man. I don't have the secrets. And of course, the moment that I say I don't have the secrets, and it's only proof that I do. And I'm like, I don't have them.
So
I
what's
don't
coming?
want them, frankly. I don't want them either.
Yeah,
if they're out there, I don't want them.
Exactly. So what's coming down the pike? What's on your radar for things that you've been studying but haven't shared yet with the world?
So what's coming up? So I guess on the channel, one of the things that's the big thing that's going to happen in the winter is we're going to do a winter seminar where we're going to really deep dive into a pretty famous esoteric text called the Corpus Hermeticum. This was the Hermeticists were a initiatory philosophical religious group that existed primarily in Egypt. But the text, the Corpus Hermeticum, became enormously influential when it was translated into Latin in the 15th century by Marsilio Ficino. And basically, a lot of occult ideas are in some sense downstream of this collection of documents called the Corpus Hermeticum. They're traditionally ascribed to Hermes Trismegistus, the thrice Greek Hermes, who is a combination of Hermes and Thoth. And one of the winter seminar, which is actually going to be what's being voted on by my Patreon supporters, is we're going to look at the philosophical foundations for how these ideas developed. Because often it's the case that people will read the Corpus Hermeticum, but they don't realize that the Egyptian religious ideas that are being expressed in the text are also taking up a lot of ideas from Middle Platonism and Middle Stoicism, which are often neglected areas of philosophical study. Most folks never study Middle Stoicism and Middle Platonism. They go from Plato and Aristotle to some of the Hellenistic folks, and then directly to Plotinus and Neoplatonism. And there's a whole chunk in the middle. In fact, and I would say that chunk in the middle is incredibly important for the development of Christianity, because that's where you're going to get the idea of the Logos, and these ideas that are going to be crucial for because obviously Christianity is developing well before Neoplatonism ever comes along in the 3rd century. And those ideas are basically the core kinds of ideas that we'll be looking at. So it's going to be a deep dive into looking at this mystical text that I think is, in some sense, more celebrated than known, to crib Voltaire, and really looking at the deep philosophical ideas that underwrite it. Because often we think of mysticism as being somehow non-rational or anti-rational, but often mystics are very rational people who have enormous learning behind them and are bringing to bear that learning to a kind of experience that in some sense transcends words. And by taking a look at the Corpus Hermeticum, which is a very deeply mystical group of texts, we'll kind of unpack them a bit by looking at them from the point of view of these lesser known and lesser studied philosophical schools there, primarily operating in Egypt in the 1st and 2nd centuries.
I'm excited. That sounds fascinating. I love how, again, it seems like every time I think I've kind of learned the different subjects, like if I can study this one, I'll kind of have a good picture of Christianity, but there's always more. And I think you just listed another one there that, it's like you got to understand the stuff, or the origins of Christianity, which I know is not your focus of your channel, but it's certainly a focus of my desire to understand, what I came from, so to speak. I love that you're bringing all these discussions to the table. And I find it fascinating too, with just to go off what you just said, these people were obviously very, very educated, very smart. And I love too how with gematria and other stuff, they're looking for patterns that some of them may be creating patterns, but they're looking for patterns that tell stories. It's like there's just the fact that they're looking for patterns is such a cool thing. And I think that's almost a whole nother subject that I'd love to dive into at some point, just what all these patterns refer to, and how they're looking for there's like a story, but then there's like a hidden story. And I just
no, and I think that impulse has never gone away, right?
Yeah.
There's this desire even among contemporary physicists that there must be some grand unified theory which unites quantum mechanics and general relativity, and the standard model is some version of what they think is sort of a grand united theory. And there are now some physicists coming around saying there might not be some secret beneath it all. It might just be a mess. And many physicists balk at that idea that no, the universe must be fundamentally elegant. It must be governed by a discrete set of laws that are discoverable by reason, and that it must be elegant. That the mathematics itself must be somehow elegant. And sometimes I joke, right? The Gnostics were half right, that the world is chaotic and bad, but they're only half right. That there's no escape. There's no light outside there's no light beyond this world. And I think that impulse to discover these fundamental secret structures of reality has never gone away. And again, the idea, like you said, right, if there's a fine line between finding patterns and making them. I think it's apophenia, right? When you look at a light socket and see a face, you have to be careful because once you start to look for the patterns, you will find them, whether they're there or not.
Yeah.
That impulse can be, I think, maddening. Can be positively maddening.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, this has been absolutely awesome. We've been going over so much, and I feel like we could dive so much deeper. And I will definitely be doing my homework, and I'd love to talk to you again in a few months if it works out, and maybe bring some even better questions next time. But for anyone that is been fascinated by this and has enjoyed this, Dr. Justin Sledge, his YouTube channel is Esoterica. I'll have the link beneath the video here for his podcast. And for anyone that can, please subscribe to him, like his videos, support him if you can, because what he's doing in these discussions is honestly extremely valuable. And you are a rare gem in some of these discussions that we're having. What you're bringing, I don't think people realize, especially the mythicist camp, just how much we need what you're talking about. It is absolutely gold to us. So thank you for doing it. Hope it continues for a long, long time. And I really appreciate, again, your channel, your work, and thank you so much for being willing to do this today with me here on my show.
Yeah, thank you, Tim. Thank you for the work you do. Having these conversations they're really interesting conversations and well worth having them. So thank you for inviting me, and yeah, I hope folks reach out, and if other folks want to have these conversations further with me, and I'm happy to do so. So thank you.
Awesome. Well, thank you again, and we'll do it again soon.
Absolutely. You take care.
Thank you.